All right, 12:31. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining this important discussion. My name is Kelly Oskvig. I work for the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine here in DC. The academies are private, nonprofit institutions that provide independent and objective analysis and advice to the U.S. to solve complex problems and inform public policy decisions related to science, technology, and medicine. I recently had the privilege of serving as study director for the 2022 National Academies study, a research strategy for ocean-based carbon dioxide removal and sequestration. You can download a copy free of charge at nap.edu, and I'll post a direct link in the chat shortly. The study, as well as this virtual session, are sponsored by Climateworks Foundation. They are a global platform for philanthropy to innovate and accelerate climate solutions at scale. So big thank you to Climateworks for your generous support for all of this work. So let's see. So quickly, the purpose of today's session is to provide a brief overview of the recent study, which, as the title suggests, recommends an extensive research agenda for advancing ocean-based CDR research, and to take that conversation to the next very important step, which is to discuss what can be done at the policy level to support the ocean CDR research outlined in the report. So we're delighted to have our panel of experts with us today to share their diverse thoughts and perspectives on the topic. We have a lot to pack into 45 minutes, so I want to get started. And first up, we have Scott Doney, who will explain the important role the ocean plays in carbon removal and provide the report overview. So Scott is the Joe D. and Helen J. Kington Professor in Environmental Change at the University of Virginia, and we are so lucky and honored to have him serve as chair of the report's authoring committee. Thank you, Scott, for all that, and for being here today. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Kelly, and if you could advance the slides. And if you could advance to the two more. So, there you go. So as Kelly mentioned, we did a study through the National Academies on ocean-based carbon dioxide removal approaches. And I wanted to just give a little context for why we might be interested at some point in deploying carbon dioxide removal and why we need a research agenda to better understand these technologies. Shown here on the left-hand side of the plot is the emissions of greenhouse gases. So in beige is carbon dioxide, and the darker brown are other greenhouse gases. And you can see that over the last several decades, these emissions have grown with time, and current carbon dioxide emissions are about 35 billion tons of CO2 per year. If we want to meet the Paris climate agreements of maintaining a global climate of less than +2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, or shoot for 1.5 degrees Celsius, we would need to rapidly reduce the net emissions of human greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, and the other gases such as methane and nitrous oxide, and reach a net zero emissions sometime before the end of this century. And you can see that as the red line would be a 2 degrees Celsius trajectory. In order to do that, you need massive amounts of decarbonization or conventional abatement technologies, things like expanding renewable energy sources such as solar or wind or nuclear, which don't emit carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, increase energy efficiency. But that may not be sufficient, because many of these greenhouse gases, including carbon dioxide, may have components that are hard to abate using traditional approaches. And so shown in the bottom in blue are the possible need for negative emissions. These would be technologies or approaches that would deliberately remove carbon dioxide to the atmosphere so we could reach a net zero balance. Next slide, please. So why the ocean? Well, one of the reasons is that the ocean's already taking up a substantial component, somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of human emissions. So on the far left-hand side here in gray are the human fossil fuel emissions, which are about 35 billion tons of carbon dioxide. The ocean naturally takes up about 10 billion tons through physical chemical dissolution of the elevated amounts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So left on its own, the ocean is already acting as a major net benefit at slowing global climate change. The other reason people are interested in possible ocean-based carbon dioxide methods is that the ocean also has processes, including the biological pump, which act to control atmospheric carbon dioxide on long time scales. And that's you see the small little circle in the ocean. Biological organisms take up carbon dioxide through photosynthesis in the surface ocean. Some part of that organic carbon that's fixed by algae and phytoplankton is converted into organic matter that can sink into the deep sea. And so this biological pump actually acts to remove carbon dioxide from the surface ocean and the atmosphere and increase it in the deep ocean. So the combination of the fact that the ocean's already a major sink for carbon dioxide, and that we know that there are biological and geochemical, as I'll get to in a minute, processes that regulate the amount of carbon in the ocean, suggests that there may be ways to alter the ocean to increase the uptake of anthropogenic carbon dioxide. Next slide, please. So the charge to the committee was to identify the most urgent questions, looking at on the research side of what could we do to learn more about the benefits, risks, potential scale, and overall viability of a set of 6 ocean-based carbon dioxide approaches. And those are shown schematically on the right-hand side. So starting in the upper right, we have nutrient fertilization. So this would be adding macronutrients, or more likely a micronutrient like iron, that would stimulate phytoplankton production and increase the biological pump to potentially increase organic carbon storage in the deep sea. Below that is artificial upwelling. There, instead of adding external nutrients to the ocean, we would pump up nutrients from the subsurface ocean that would also stimulate biological productivity. Though that comes with a caveat that also can bring up excess carbon dioxide from the deep sea. So the same biological pump processes that transport carbon into the deep sea also load up high levels of carbon dioxide in many subsurface waters. Moving over to the left, you have seaweed cultivation. So this would be growing macroalgae and then transporting it or allowing it to sink into the deep sea, another pathway for the biological pump. Below that is ecosystem recovery. We know that many marine ecosystems have been highly damaged in the past by coastal habitat destruction, overfishing, whaling, and efforts to restore those ecosystems may alter the balance of carbon storage in the ocean, and thus could either be a net benefit if it enhances carbon storage, or perhaps neutral, or even a small negative. And then finally, at the upper center and the upper left are more geochemical approaches. One of the reasons why the ocean is such a good sink for carbon dioxide is that the ocean is alkaline because of the weathering products of rocks on land. So versus say fresh water, seawater can hold a lot more carbon dioxide. And by adding the dissolution products, or actually even just grinding up certain minerals and adding to the ocean, potentially you could increase ocean alkalinity and thus increase the ability of the ocean to take up carbon dioxide. And then finally, the electrochemical methods are splitting water using the byproducts of that electrochemical splitting of water to acidify the water, strip out the carbon dioxide, and store it in a geologic reservoir on land. Next slide, please. So as part of the study, the committee developed a set of assessment criteria. So for each of these techniques, we looked at knowledge base, efficacy, how effective would this technique be in terms of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Durability is a measure of how long that carbon dioxide that's removed from the atmosphere stays in the ocean. So it's a measure of the permanence of the approach, scale, monitoring and verification needs, potential viability and barriers, including both the social components and the environmental components. So humans are a key aspect of all of these discussions because coastal communities could be heavily impacted by the scale of carbon dioxide removal approaches. And then governance and social dimensions. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to go through these tables in detail, but I just want to let you know that within the report for each of these assessment criteria, we looked at all of the different approaches and we have detailed descriptions giving a sense for where we are in terms of, for example, knowledge base or efficacy. What you can immediately see is that there, because of the different colors within this table, no single technique scored highly on all criteria. Each of the techniques have a unique set of strengths and weaknesses. Some techniques there's a long history of. Others are relatively new and have primarily been studied in computer simulations and laboratory experiments. Similarly for environmental risk or scalability or social considerations. Next slide, please. We also looked at issues such as cost of scale up, the challenges of actually accounting for how much carbon dioxide is removed, unlike a lot of approaches on land, because the ocean is a turbulent moving fluid. The carbon dioxide that might be removed at one locale won't stay there. And so you need to account for the transport of that, but also downstream effects from the technique. All of these approaches have a fairly substantial cost of environmental monitoring, particularly in the early pilot stages. And some of them require additional resources like energy, or for example, the alkalinity would require a substantial amount of mining of minerals. Next slide, please. So the overall recommendation of the report is that to inform future societal decisions, it would be beneficial to have a research program on ocean carbon dioxide removal. The goal of the research program is to provide an improved and unbiased knowledge base on these different techniques. It is not to either, it's not there to promote or indicate that we should do or not do any of these techniques. The conclusion of the committee is that for most of these techniques or all these techniques, we don't have a sufficient knowledge base to make informed decisions. Next slide, please. So we developed within the report a research agenda that's in two components. One is a foundational research component. So these are things that are common across all of the different techniques I mentioned. So work that needs to be done to better understand the legal and regulatory framework, codes of conduct for ethical research that engages with stakeholders and the public, monitoring and accounting of the impacts of these techniques and the ability to actually document the carbon stored, social dimensions, policy support, and capacity building. Next slide, please. I'm going to skip that. Can you go to the next slide, please, Kelly? And then we also have specific research elements laid out for each of the 6 techniques that we looked at. And you can look at the report and dig into those in detail. Next slide, please. And then finally, within the report, we indicated that any research plan should be adaptive. So we need at the bottom of this plot in gray is this foundational research that needs to be front-loaded and done early on as you're starting to spin up research on each of the individual techniques. And that the adaptive component is that at some point we might learn enough from the research to decide that a technique is not viable, either because of geophysical constraints or social constraints, political constraints. And then you would want to be able to have the ability and flexibility to shift resources to other approaches that we looked at, or potentially to new approaches that were not studied as part of this report. And then next slide, I think this is the last slide. I'm not going to go through all this in detail, but key takeaways are we may need to deploy carbon dioxide removal at some point in the future. We don't have sufficient knowledge right now to decide whether this is a net benefit and what the downsides of these techniques are. And that's the basis for a recommendation for a research strategy and research investments. Next slide. And I think this is just the switch over. Thanks, Kelly.
All right. Thank you so much, Scott, for providing the overview. Scott did a much longer briefing of the report last December, and I'll post the link to that in the chat in case any of you would like to dig into a little more detail. And again, there's the link to the report as well, which you can download at no cost. So next we have our panel discussion moderated by Romany Webb. Romany is an associate research scholar at Columbia Law School and senior fellow at the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law. We were also both lucky and honored to have Romany serve on the report's authoring committee and to keep the committee thinking about the overarching legal and governance considerations of tinkering with the ocean. So thank you, Romany, for continuing to help with the report dissemination and advance this conversation. The mic is yours.
Thanks, Kelly, and hi, everyone. It's really nice to be here with you all today virtually and to have the opportunity to moderate this great lineup of speakers in the panel discussion. Before we get to that, I just wanted to provide a few additional framing comments for the panel, and then I'll hand over and then I'll introduce them. So as we heard from Scott, there is a need for further scientific research to fully assess the efficacy of different ocean CDR techniques and to evaluate their potential risks and co-benefits. And it's really imperative that that scientific research occur alongside and be integrated with research on the legal, policy, and social dimensions of ocean CDR. As we note in the report, those aspects of ocean CDR have received relatively little attention to date, but are really key to advancing successful and responsible scientific research, and if it's ultimately deemed appropriate, larger scale deployment of ocean CDR. So as Kelly said, I am a lawyer by training, and I tend to focus on some of the legal issues around ocean CDR research and deployment. And so if we think about the legal context in which this is occurring, there is still a lot of uncertainty around the legal frameworks that will apply to different ocean CDR techniques, both at the international level and domestically here in the US. There's been relatively little research on those issues, and the research that has been conducted suggests that there are a number of gaps and shortcomings in existing legal frameworks that could hinder safe and responsible research. And so it's really important that we begin thinking now about how to redesign legal frameworks. And in my view, the legal framework should be designed in a way that enables necessary research, but that ensures that that research occurs or is conducted in a scientifically sound and safe manner that minimizes any potential risks to the environment, to coastal communities, or to other stakeholders. Similarly, on the policy side, we need to be thinking about crafting policy mechanisms to support safe and responsible research and deployment if that's deemed appropriate. To date, in the US, climate policy has been largely focused on emissions reductions, which of course is absolutely essential. But if we do end up wanting to scale CDR and use CDR as part of our climate mitigation portfolio, then we will likely need CDR specific policy. And again, as Scott said, that CDR policy really needs to complement other climate policy, including emissions reductions policy. And so we need to design policy solutions and policy mechanisms that don't lock in future CDR deployment and certainly don't deter or delay other actions to mitigate climate change. Because as we've heard, CDR is just one of the potential tools in the toolbox, and other actions will also need to be taken. One final thing that I wanted to note before we hear from our panelists is that I often, when I talk about these issues, hear from people who say, isn't it premature to be thinking about legal and policy options for supporting ocean CDR now, given that the approaches are still in the development stage, still being tested and evaluated? But again, as we note in the report, it's really important that we engage on those legal and policy and social issues now. Because if we delay action on the legal and policy and social side, we risk reducing incentives for businesses and governments and research organizations to invest and expend effort exploring these techniques. So I want to turn now to our panelists to get their thoughts on policy needs to support ocean CDR. I'm going to introduce all of them together. We'll hear some opening thoughts from each of them, and then we'll take questions. So if you have questions for any of our panelists or for Scott, please type them in the chat and I will pull them out. So first we're going to hear from Dr. Libby Jewett, who is a NOAA scientist with diverse experience in ocean acidification and coastal hypoxia research programs. She currently serves as the first director of NOAA's Ocean Acidification Program. She earned her PhD from the University of Maryland in biology. After Libby, we're going to hear from Dr. Simon Freeman, who serves as a program director at ARPA-E at the Department of Energy. His focus is on maritime energy and environmental sensing technologies. And after Simon, we will go to Liz Whiteman, who's the executive director of the Coastal Ocean Science Trust. Liz trained as a marine ecologist and has spent the past decade working at the Science Policy Interface in California on topics including marine protected areas, sea level rise, and ocean acidification. And then last but not least, we will turn to Dr. Matthew Eiserman, who is the co-founder and chief technology officer for Ebb Carbon. Matt has spent the last decade developing technologies that capture carbon dioxide from the air using the natural ocean atmosphere equilibrium. And he's also an associate professor at Stony Brook University. So Libby, we'll turn to you first.
All right, thank you. So that was a great, all of that introduction was awesome. And I agree, I couldn't agree with you more. There's a lot that we need to do. So I'm director of NOAA's Ocean Acidification Program. I'm also chair of the Ocean Acidification Interagency Working Group under the Subcommittee on Ocean Science and Technology, which is one of many White House committees. And I wanted to talk today about kind of a little bit of the federal landscape, and I'm sure Simon will also talk about that somewhat. I will say that that federal agencies are thinking about marine CDR, and in fact CDR in general, because we realize we have to consider all options for removing CO2, as noted by Scott. However, as of now, none of us, or at least NOAA, does not have clear legislative requirements around this yet. There is some language, there was some language in the infrastructure bill, but other than that, we're sort of seeing little hints of legislation coming to our attention for our input. We've also seen some appropriation language potentially coming down the pike in FY23. So I think Congress is getting the message, but we need to continue to provide that message. And I think the National Academies report did a lot to move the needle. In terms of ocean acidification, obviously, given that carbon dioxide in seawater causes ocean acidification, my program, and we're one of the only named OA programs in the federal government, my program's interested in how marine carbon dioxide removal approaches might mitigate ocean acidification. So, our investments would be towards testing these approaches, which we hope would then help move the needle in terms of our understanding of how they work as we potentially move into larger scale implementation. So the legislation that set up my program was the Federal OA Research and Monitoring Program, also called FORAM, which actually has requirements in it for my program to be funding OA mitigation research. And so I'm using that as a tool for trying to kind of push our agency forward in funding MCDR work. Beyond my program at NOAA, we are still figuring out exactly what our role in marine CDR might be. But we know we have an important role. We know we do. We have written a draft research strategy, which has been the work of many, many people over a very long time, maybe a year, year and a half, almost 2 years of work. That research strategy, we hope, will make it through the approval process in NOAA and be released to the general public in the next few months. And that will help kind of clarify what we think our role might be. So in addition, more importantly, to kind of push the envelope with the resources that we have now, I've convened an interagency group with participants from NOAA, DOE, including Simon, National Science Foundation, Navy, EPA, among others, as well as important private philanthropic partners like Climateworks, who are sponsoring this session. And actually, we'll be announcing our first funded project with resources that we have in hand. We'll be announcing that shortly, probably in the next month. We've also started conversations about a larger request for proposals, which will hopefully be administered through the National Oceanographic Partnership Program for FY23. So we're beginning to move forward basically with the resources that we have in hand, with the hope that we will have more resources in the future to be able to put towards this important effort. So I think I'll stop there and turn it over to Simon.
Thank you, Libby. It's a great introduction, and suffice to say, there's a lot of work happening in the federal space. People are really aware of and excited by the possibilities of ocean CDR. I mean, just the scale alone is probably the one big factor when you consider the impacts regarding competing land use. It's a no-brainer. I mean, the ocean is a very important place when it comes to CDR, potentially more important than land. So just to take a step back, I'll explain a little bit about what ARPA-E is and why I'm here. So ARPA-E is the Advanced Research Projects Agency for the Department of Energy, sort of like DARPA, but for energy, and we're much younger and smaller than the defense, our defense counterpart. But we have a similar approach to solving big problems. So looking for transformative new technologies, and we're very willing to engage in high risk, high reward research endeavors. So our mandate covers a lot of energy related issues, including emissions, so emission controls. That includes mitigation. And so of course, seeing as CO2 as an anthropogenic emission, it falls under our wheelhouse to be concerned about how to control those emissions and mitigate their impacts. So I came here about 8 months ago with an interest in ocean CDR, and quickly discovered that there was a critical issue that faces us if we are to between us now where we stand and where we could stand in terms of a large ocean CDR industry in the future. And that is the measurement, reporting, and validation of carbon. So basically, if you were to create some sort of ocean CDR system, whether it be a machine or fertilizing the ocean, we have to know how successful that system is and how many, say, tons of carbon you're sequestering in a given time, because in a carbon market, that's the only way you'll have value. So if a bank is going to finance you with a loan to increase your business size and increase your CDR capability, they have to know how much value your technology holds, how much return on their investment could they see. Those numbers aren't often very easy to obtain, and they come with error bars. Even just quantifying what those error bars may be is something that is a lofty goal for us. Think about tracking a plume of smoke after it's left the chimney. A lot of these CDR methods are distributed, so you would have to track sort of carbon-rich plumes that come out of an iron enrichment experiment or similar for weeks to even years to really understand what the fates of that carbon that you may have removed from the atmosphere and surface oceans may be. there are also some significant unknowns with regards to the biological carbon pump. So we saw an overview of the National Academies report on ocean CDR. Some of the techniques involve leveraging the natural biological processes in the ocean that bring carbon out of the atmosphere and the surface oceans down into the deep oceans through the sinking of the bodies of phytoplankton and the formation of marine snow. So significant parts of that the carbon circulation there are not things that we can sense today. So for example, the dissolved organic carbon fraction in seawater is something that, to really do a good job of understanding how much dissolved organic carbon there is, you have to take that water sample, bring it back into a lab and perform analyses on it. It's very difficult to do that work in situ, let alone over hundreds of square miles like you may need to do to quantify an ocean CDR event. And for every ton of carbon you miss, that's lost money. In a carbon market, you want to be able to make as much, to gain as much value as you can out of your carbon dioxide removal operations. And to address the regulatory questions, these types of abilities to perform effective measurement, reporting, and validation are critical for regulating the industry. You need to know what the success of various endeavors may be for CDR. You need to understand what is happening not only to carbon flows, but also to other sort of non-carbon ocean parameters. So environmental impacts are something that's on the forefront of everybody's minds. If you grow very large quantities of seaweed in the ocean, for example, seaweed sinking is one of these carbon dioxide removal approaches. As you sink the seaweed, you may remove carbon, but you may also remove nutrients from the surface ocean. What impacts will that have to the pelagic ecosystems and also deep sea ecosystems as you introduce these nutrients along with the carbon down onto the seafloor? So the quantification of these secondary or ancillary effects is really, really crucial. Then if you can assign some sort of mitigative measure or an element of a financial quantification of the risk, then that really helps with market regulation and the setting the price people are willing to pay for a ton of carbon. That said, we would like a situation in the future where a carbon market is, it's populated mainly by private sector folks, people looking to buy carbon credits and so on. They are looking for the certainty as well. If you propose a CDR technology, how successful is it going to be? What is the price of MRV per ton of carbon? In addition to the actual cost of moving the carbon down into the deep ocean or into some other permanent sequestration modality. So at ARPA-E, we are currently in the process of program development. So we're looking at transformative technologies that could revolutionize the at-sea measurement and reporting and validation of carbon and carbon flows. In addition to the measurement, I should also add that modeling is going to be a critical component of that. So data assimilation from these new methods of sensing the ocean into models that will allow us to make estimates as accurately as possible and to save a lot of effort in future sampling endeavors. And once we know how these systems work, we could model them and then greatly expedite how we can estimate CDR success. So look out for efforts from our end in terms of program development in the next months to maybe a year. We'll be organizing workshops and hosting industry days to get people really excited about this transformative approach to new methods for carbon sensing for the purpose of MRV in the ocean. Thanks.
Thanks, Simon. Liz?
All right, so thank you so much for the opportunity to participate in this conversation today. I just wanted to begin by mentioning, it's already been shared, but the National Academies report provides a really important roadmap for ocean CDR scientific research. And we've been thinking about that at the state level in California. I'm privileged to work at the sometimes challenging nexus of cutting edge science and sound ocean and coastal policy. as a non-governmental, non-partisan organization actually created by the California legislature to bridge the gap between science and policy here in California. This topic and the challenge of responsibly unlocking research funding is at the heart of our mission. So working at the state level and riffing off the challenge that Romani and Kelly laid down for us, we ask questions like, what is the role of our elected leaders in the California legislature? How can we empower them with advice and recommendations? And where can and should our state agencies, the managing and regulating agencies, engage? And is there a way that coming together around our scientific knowns and uncertainties can bridge some of the traditional silos in government agencies? So digging into each of those briefly for a moment, as you likely all know, California's elected leaders are not shy about setting aspirational climate goals. But it's worth, I think, noting that with those aspirations comes the responsibility of enabling the development of new technologies and new solutions that are going to be critical to reaching those goals. Not jumping into implementation in one go, but at least enabling the venues and resources for thoughtful learning and research. At the same time, members and staffers necessarily, of course, operate 10 miles wide and an inch deep, and often don't have access to science in a way that is actually actionable to them, either in policy or investment decisions. So it probably sounds obvious, but it is often overlooked that there is a huge value in proactively creating a venue for science dialogue. One of the California Ledge members said to me a couple of months ago, if only I could sit in a room with 4 to 5 scientists on this topic and cut through all the interests. And many more of the elected officials don't even think about oceans on a daily basis like we do. Never mind the details of things like important social and ethical considerations of CDR research. So then turning briefly to the managing and regulating government agencies. In California, moving forward with, I'll pick up the nature-based CDR strategies such as aquaculture, tops the list of conversations seemingly stuck in perpetual circles here. And I think as a broad community of scientists and conservation professionals, we often decry how our government agencies are not doing enough or bemoan the bureaucratic barriers to moving forward on things like permitting. And permitting doesn't sound like the most sexy thing to think about or talk about. And sometimes that moaning is justified. But in this case, the capacity and resource limitations are very real. And the existing laws, rules, and policies for aquaculture, for example, were created for a very different time and purpose. If we want to activate research to pilot and test seaweed farming as a climate solution, it's essential that we also find ways to invest in and build capacity in the relevant state government agencies. Just to give one example of many threads to pull on there, currently California's permitting structure doesn't allow for experimental projects by for-profit enterprises. And thus it inhibits the kind of public-private partnerships for research that I think are at the core of a lot of the kind of research that Simon mentioned previously. So I'll be brief and just close by echoing Romani and noting that, to really enable or activate a CDR research agenda, our perspective here in California, if that is to include things like in-water testing of solutions for like seaweed aquaculture, for example, we can't just think of this as an exercise for academia or science research funders. We need to align the interests of state government, who are limited by resources and capacity, industry and business. As Simon said, it's got to make sense financially, the environmental NGO community, and scientists to incentivize the cutting edge research that will build in appropriate approaches for evaluation and accountability of these new tools. So this is no small feat, of course, and I'm biased, I admit, but I think there is an important role for boundary spanners and science policy practitioners. And I think is and can be a science conversation, but does need to bring everybody to the table. So I will pause it there and pass over to Matthew.
Great, thanks so much. And thanks a lot for the invitation. I appreciate it. So as Romany mentioned, I'm a professor at Stony Brook University, and I'm also CTO and co-founder of Ebb Carbon. And Ebb is a company that is commercializing electrochemical ocean alkalinity enhancement for carbon dioxide removal and reversal of ocean acidification. And so my comments will be from both of these perspectives. I think first, Scott explained the science is clear and we need really kind of gigatons of CO2 per year scale carbon removal by mid-century. And so this is really an enormous challenge with a pretty short timeline. As a result, we need to act quickly, but we need to do it safely. And so we need to quickly and safely figure out which of the carbon dioxide removal technologies that are being pursued are effective and safe and scalable so that we can scale those ones as quickly as possible. I think that's the situation we're in now. And I think that will require really 4 key developments in my mind. So the first is increased R&D funding, which the National Academies report really lays out well. Second, which Liz sort of pointed to just now, is also mentioned in the report, is we really need, we see this on the ground at Ebb, we really need to establish clear processes and criteria for permitting these ocean carbon dioxide removal research projects and field deployments so that we can perform the field trials that we need to determine which of these approaches are the safest and most effective and have the most co-benefits. 3, and Simon got to this point, this is really potentially like a multi-billion-dollar industry, but it's waiting for measurements and standards for carbon removal verification. And so practitioners like Ebb need to build this capacity by working with national labs and federal agencies like NOAA and Department of Energy. And so we're really eager to work with agencies like that on that part of the problem. And then 4th is just making sure, I think, that the carbon removal legislation is outcome focused and tech agnostic, right? So that the legislation supports the whole ecosystem of carbon removal approaches that are being developed, and that includes land-based approaches, but not forgetting to include ocean-based approaches as well. And with that, maybe we can move on to questions. Send it back to Romney.
Thank you, Matthew. And thanks to all our panelists for some really interesting remarks. We have just a couple of minutes, and it looks like most of the audience questions have been already answered in the chat. So I will maybe ask each of our panelists to just answer one question briefly. Several of you mentioned sort of the need for legislative engagement on some of these issues. Liz, you mentioned, legislators wanting to sit down with scientists and, cut through all of the rhetoric and really understand sort of the science. But if each of you could speak to legislators either at the federal level or at the state level, what's sort of the one most important thing that you think they should know, or the one most important thing that you think that they should do moving forward? And we'll go in reverse order. So Matt, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I think my answer will be short. So it's one of the things I already mentioned, which is that establishing criteria for permitting, I think, would really allow these field trials to go forward at the pace we need.
Liz, how about you?
Since I've already mentioned permitting, I think the most important thing they need to know, so legislators want to know, what can I do? And they can either advance policy or investment, but they don't actually know what it's going to take on the state agency side right now. There isn't clear direction about the capacity and resources needed. So I think if we can convey that for a thoughtful research program, we can encourage next steps.
Thank you. Simon.
I think that Matt hit the nail on the head. The streamlining of permitting for R&D in terms of developing CDR technologies and also MRV is critical. I mean, today, CDR is defined as dumping, right, which is inherently an environmentally damaging process, but we're trying to save the environment here. And And every year we wait, it's 36 gigatons more CO2 is released into the atmosphere. So, you know, it's when you talk to young folks, you definitely get this impression of climate anxiety, and that anxiety is only going to grow. And I think when we can translate the response into action through expediting permits and so on, I think we can really make a big difference. And we can the encouragement that governments can place before the industry in the fast tracking of permits and the sort of facilitation of R&D, I think is really going to give people a lot of hope.
And final word, Libby.
Yeah, well, I also agree about the permitting part. The other request I would have is when legislation is passed that's directed at the federal agencies, ideally, and this hardly ever happens, but ideally it would say, DOE is responsible for this, NOAA is responsible for this, NSF is responsible for this, and then we don't have to have this like scrum to figure that out. And more often than not, everything isn't clarified, but even if we had some indication of like where the swim lanes are, things will happen faster. So that's my request.
Yeah, I think an issue that also arises at the state level. I see Liz nodding. And, indicative of a broader problem, I think, in the legal and policy frameworks are really sort of playing catch up here. And so we're trying to fit these new approaches in many cases into existing legal and policy frameworks that aren't particularly well aligned for what we're trying to do, and end up being more of an impediment than a help, either in terms of facilitating research, but also ensuring that that research occurs in a safe and responsible manner. So I will turn it back to Kelly to close us out, but thanks to all our panelists for a great discussion.
Yeah, wow, time flies. Thank you so much, Romany, and to all our panelists for a really great discussion on how policy can help to advance, support, and fund much needed research on enhancing the ocean's natural ability to sequester atmospheric CO2, and to potentially aid drastic emission reductions and help us meet climate goals. It was also really exciting to hear about program development, the funding opportunities that are out there and being developed, and all the interest that's out there at this very moment. That helped to ease some of my climate anxiety. So thanks for all the important work that you all are doing. My email is on the slide along with other resources discussed. Please let me know if you have any questions or suggestions. I know this was really short. And please enjoy the rest of CHOW, and thank you for joining.